understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. Just going to say, John, the podcast that makes economics comprehensible, a little bit more...
Reasonable.
Less arsey. Anyway, how are you, Hed?
I'm good. I'm still on my sugar buzz since Halloween, actually.
Well, I can tell you, John came in here this afternoon and I was eating forlornly barnbrack, lots of butter, surrounded by...
Did you find the ring?
Not yet. I never know, somebody might pick me up. But surrounded by mountains of mini Mars bars, Twixes.
Yeah.
I went out to Tesco's yesterday and I bought an unfeasible amount of E-numbers. And we are now coming down with really, mini chipsticks, delicious stuff.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I went out and I got a little pumpkin and I got a happy Halloween sign and I put it up in the door and I waited, myself and Shan, and we waited, and Lucy thought it was very cute and she took photos of us, being excited, and nobody turned up. Not one, not two.
You must have frightened him away, Mac.
The
orange hair behind the door.
Obviously the place looks like a haunted house or something. Kids, there was always a house in the street you wouldn't go into.
Yeah.
That's ours. I didn't realise.
So you know where to come now if you're looking for some sugar.
If you're looking for sugar, I tell you, we have mini Twixes, mini Bounties. We have bags of...
5 for 20.
5 for 20. I'll give them away free. Uncharacteristically. Anyway. That was our Halloween, John. And
well, speaking of which, I saw you were reading Frankenstein when it came in there. It was Frankenstein, wasn't it?
It was Wittgenstein, John.
Oh, Wittgenstein. Frankenstein.
Wittgenstein. No, I am reading. Yeah, poor old John comes in and I'm deep and I'm engrossed in this book at the moment. What I was fascinated by is these fellas, right? Keynes, J.M. Keynes, which I'm trying to do...
Economist now, we're talking.
Economist fella, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to do a bit of... not Frankenstein. Okay, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, and Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher.
Yeah.
And what is fascinating for me is about 100 years ago, about 115 years ago, these guys, despite the fact that World War I was going on, right? Mm-hmm. And Austria and Britain were on opposite sides, were continuing to chat with each other. And Wittgenstein was writing letters to Keynes, right, about his new ideas from the battlefield.
Right.
And those letters were getting into London, even though they were coming from an Austrian field position close to the Austrian-Italian border, which is fascinating because I was just thinking about how in those times, prior to World War I, where you have loads of free movement of capital, free movement of goods, but you also have the free movement of ideas. These people were all talking to each other, and it's...
By pigeon, was it? like with the Rothschilds.
Exactly. With the Rothschilds, that was even earlier. That was the Battle of Waterloo.
Right, yeah.
That's how he won the Battle of Waterloo, because his pigeons were quicker than the other lads' pigeons, which is kind of, it's an interesting monetary angle on pigeon. What do you call somebody who breeds
fancier?
Pigeon fancying. Isn't that a lovely expression?
Yeah.
Pigeon fan. So I was reading Wittgenstein while I was here, but the reason I was reading it is because we're going to talk about the nature of power in this podcast, right?
Yes.
Who owns it, who buys it, who wields it, who gets to acquire it, and how that happens. And one of the interesting parts of those guys, thinking about those guys and how they were thinking, was perceptions of power. Marx had this idea that power was like capitalists and workers. And that was the whole idea. And ultimately they were all in that Marxian world.
Yeah.
Although they broke away from it. All of them actually broke away from it eventually. But there's another way of looking at power, which I think is important ahead of the American election. And it's this idea that power historically has been wielded by three, not classes, as Marx would talk about, but castes, three sort of subdivisions in society.
What do you mean?
So the three castes are the warrior caste, the priestly caste, and the merchant caste, right?
Right.
So this is a very, very historical way of looking at power in societies, right? The warrior class are the warlords, the army, those sort of guys, right? Historically.
Yeah.
The priestly class were the scribes, the Brehons here, Breton law and all that sort of stuff here.
The Brahmins
in India. The church here, ecclesiastical power in the old days. And then, of course, the third part is the merchant class, the money class,
Yeah.
right? And they all kind of interchange. You take, for example, the United States, right? The United States, you have, for example, the technocracy, the technocratic class, probably best evidenced by Kamala Harris. And, for example, people like Barack Obama, technocratic people
Right.
who
Okay.
come to the election with an ideology, with a convincing, a sort of theocracy. It's like we believe in these ideas.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you have the billionaire class, who are the merchant class, and the smaller billionaires, all of whom want to wield power. And then, of course, you have the warrior caste in America, would have been a warrior class, but emboldened by and brought together by things like race, tribe, ethnicity, opposition to outsiders, all that sort of stuff,
Okay.
right? Because they would be the conquering class. So in a way, the MAGA guys have sort of absorbed that. You know, when they said no immigrants, you know, we are America first. America first would be a very isolationist caste idea, which would have its historical DNA would be in this warrior class.
Yeah.
And a way of looking at power is the intersection between the merchant caste, who are quite cosmopolitan, quite international. Davos man, right?
Yeah.
International, they are corporatist. They believe in an open meritocratic world, that basically we are all part of one world. And their basic idea is that, you know, money is the arbiter. It's international. We're kind of international. And they're quite cosmopolitan. They tend not necessarily to be very, very attached to big ideas, right? Then you have, of course, the caste that would have been the priests in the old days. And they are now the technocrats, right? So they interpret the laws. They interpret... Economists would be a great example of the priestly class.
Yeah.
People who explain the world to people in their own
Yeah.
patois. And then, of course, you've got the warlike, the big sort of heavy warlike caste. And if you think about America, right? America's got the military-industrial complex, which is absolutely huge, which is, as Eisenhower said, is a power base on its own. Then you have the technocratic class, which would be, again, sort of modern, identified with ideology. And then you have the merchant class. And if you look at this election, or all elections, they can be seen as a status quo shifting between these power bases in all societies, right? Now, because in a society like Ireland, we don't have a warlike class because we don't really have an army.
Yeah.
What we have a battle is between the technocratic class and the merchant class. And they're constantly trying to play the game with each other. And of course, in Ireland, or in Europe, because we realized that these castes are trying to influence each other, we have actually stopped the idea of rich people being able to buy elections.
Yes.
Because we understand that there's a relationship between all these.
Which is not the case.
Which is not the case in the United States.
In fact, it's that on steroids.
So this is what we're going to talk about today, which is the relationship between these three power bases in the United States. And interestingly, this exists over and above the electorate.
Yeah.
So the electorate come forth in this idea. So you've got these three big power bases, and then you have the people who are assumed to vote one way or another after these big caste systems have figured out who's going to hang out with each other. And of course, the way in which you see this most explicitly in America, which is in what you called last week, you phoned me up when you said, let's talk about this billionaire coup.
Yes.
In the United States.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to talk about. It's the role of money in the United States electoral system, which makes it quite different to almost any other democratic system.
Yeah.
In the case of Russia, it's very explicit. There is the role of money. We can see exactly what is going on there, where Russia has got this bizarre system, and China, which is proximity to the top man gives you lots and lots of goodies. And therefore, we all genuflect to the top man. In the United States, at least on paper, the idea is it's a democracy. So you have these three power bases. But as somebody once says, the United States is the best democracy money can buy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what it is.
That whole myth of, you can come from nothing. You could come from...
Yeah, like Donald Trump, come from nothing.
Yeah, and become president. In principle, yes, you can. That is part of the American dream. But in reality, it's utter bullshit. It's all about money.
It's but certainly at the very, very top level. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the history of money in American elections. We're going to explain why, as Europeans, this looks very, very dangerous. We're also going to look at what the status quo is in France, in Germany, here in Ireland. And then we're going to contrast that with the States. And then we're going to suggest, if money wins the election on Tuesday, right? If money wins the American election, what does it say about America? And does this solidify the position of billionaires? Or could we be reaching something I would call peak billionaire, where in actual fact, the pendulum is about to swing against them?
Yeah.
And this may well be the high point of the plutocratic influence on American elections.
Well, I mean, just on that point, what actually prompted me calling you up last week about the billionaire coup is because I had seen a thing where Elon Musk was talking about the election and about government. And what he said was, it is a false dichotomy to look at government and industry as separate. Government is the ultimate corporation, and government is a monopoly that can't go bankrupt. So
he's right on those things. The government is a monopoly and it can't go bankrupt.
Absolutely. But it's not a corporation and should never be run like a corporation.
No, you're right. But of course, he probably says that because his businesses have, in large part, been functions of the American government.
Yeah.
They've been supported by the American government.
But the other thing about Elon Musk and why I brought it up is because he has now positioned himself as, one of the key guys. He's going to have a really influential position by all accounts.
A massively influential position.
The other story that broke last week was Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, blocking the Washington Post's endorsement of Harris. And if you look at a lot of the media around America now, the LA Times, and there's a whole list of them that have all been bought by billionaires with their own particular agenda. And that's where the power and the influence is.
And the story is.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of history.
Please.
Right? Because we're going to end at today's, in effect, American election.
Yeah.
But we're going to start in the election of 1896, which I've talked to you about before.
Go on.
Which is the Wizard of Oz election.
Yes.
Right? So the election of 1896 is the event that sparked a guy called Frank L. Baum to write an allegorical children's story, which wasn't a children's story at all, about the Wizard of Oz called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And it was, again, an allegory on the crucial debate in the 1896 election, which was unique in American history for a number of reasons. But the first one was it was an election fought over the arcane notion of monetary policy, which I know gives you, I can sense, John, you're already absolutely fascinated.
Yes,
right?
I am,
okay? Yeah. And it was against the background of, we're talking about billionaires in America now, of the Gilded Age. So there was the age where the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, all these people, they were called the robber barons, right? And they had amassed in the previous 10 or 15 years in America enormous wealth, largely based on electricity, railroads, steelworks, all those sort of things, right? So they were unbelievably powerful, right? But at the same time, the average American farmer and the average American worker was feeling left behind. So it's exactly the same as what's happening now. There was a sense that the wealth was all concentrated in Wall Street and Washington, okay, because Silicon Valley wasn't a thing then, right? And in the urban centers of the Northeast, where the industrialists and the corporations were doing extremely well. And there was a perception that the people who were paying for all this were the farmers, particularly out in the Midwest.
Yeah.
The Midwest and the South. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. So the basic idea was that the average American man was becoming increasingly impoverished and relatively impoverished vis-a-vis the billionaire class. And the culprit in all this was the gold standard. So the idea was that if America was tied to the gold standard, because there's more silver than gold, if you tie your currency to silver, there'll be more currency around. Yeah. Right? And if you tie it to gold, there'll be less currency around. Now, the Americans had switched from silver to gold just after the Civil War. They had Alexander Hamilton's silver standard, which we know because we've done this before.
Yes, we have.
From 1792, the Coinage Act, all the way up until 1866, the Americans used what they call a silver dollar. They changed this after the Civil War for a variety of reasons. We don't need to go into it now. But the perception was that poor people were being shafted because gold was so scarce and dollars were so scarce that the people with dollars, i.e. the rich people, didn't want to give them away.
Yeah.
And the people without dollars, i.e. the poor people, wanted more of them. And a way in which they could do this would have an internal devaluation, and it would be something called bimetallism. That was what the election was all about. It's kind of complex stuff, but anyway. And the party that advocated this most was a populist party, and then they merged with the Democrat Party in 1896 under a guy called Brian Jennings. Remember I told you William Brian Jennings? And he was up against a guy called William McKinley. And Brian Jennings was an amazing orator. He was a really good public speaker, and McKinley was not. And McKinley then, but tactically, he made a very, very, very smart move. He said, look, I cannot compete with this guy out in the open because he's a much better public speaker. But what I can do is I can bring all vested interests to me and I can listen to them. It was called front porch politics, right?
Right.
So he brought them to his porch, like, those kind of verandas they have in America.
Sitting on your squeaky, rocking chair.
Yeah. So
with your banjo.
With your banjo, exactly. And in his case, with your checkbook.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the interesting thing. So he decided that he would go and listen to all these vested interests, but rather than go out and talk to them in the open, he'd bring them to him, right? Now, of course, he also had a guy working for him called Mark Hanna, right? Yeah. And Mark Hanna was a financier. So he was the first of the real financiers. So what McKinley realized is that the populists had the argument, they had the people, they had the mobilization, but they didn't have much money. So what he needed money, and he needed direct access to the power bases who would then bring their people with them. And Mark Hanna, it's an amazing thing, raised $16 million.
Wow.
In McKinley's campaign, which is over $600 million in today's money.
Wow.
And that was the first election where money made a massive difference, right?
Yeah.
Now, fascinatingly, do you know who the Wizard of Oz was in The Wizard of Oz? Who the allegory was for the Wizard of Oz?
So we know the actor.
We know that Dorothy was the average American, and the straw man was the average farmer, and the tin man was the average industrial worker, and all that stuff. The Wizard of Oz was meant to be this guy, Mark Hanna.
Right, okay.
Who was the behind the scenes, pulling the strings, exactly as the Wizard of Oz was doing, pulling the strings and financing McKinley. So American corporate history and American corporate involvement in American elections begins really in 1896. And it has ever been thus. That, I'll just say, I'll give you a quote. I'll give you a quote from Hanna. He was asked after they won the election, what's the story in politics? And he said, there are two things in politics that are incredibly important. The first is money, and the second one, I can't remember, right? So he was basically saying, that's it. It's money. And it's ever been thus in America.
He sounds a bit like Roy Cohn.
Oh, you've just been to see the movie, haven't you?
Yeah, I went to see The Apprentice last night, and it's brilliant. And Roy Cohn, is your man Kendall Roy playing him from
the most method of all method actors.
Yeah, and it feels like he's completely overplaying him. But everything I've read about Roy Cohn is that actually he wasn't overplaying. That's how he was. But he was all about
give me an example. He was a creepy guy, was he?
Really creepy. He was a psychopath. He took Trump under his wing. He saw something in Trump. But he
was the kind of Mark Hanna of the present day.
He was exactly the Mark Hanna. Actually, I'll just say this one thing. What surprised me most about the movie...
What surprised you most?
...was the fact that it was a Canadian, Danish and Irish production. Screen Ireland actually funded it.
I'm glad that Screen Ireland is putting money into something that actually works.
It was the last thing I would have expected. But anyway.
So these characters have been behind American politics for the last century and 20 years, 120 years, right?
Yeah.
So in the old days, it used to be the case that the Republicans were always for sale and the Democrats were only for rent.
Yeah.
The Democrats felt a little bit better. But in fact, if you look at what's happening now, that is not the case. The Democrats are as keen on corporate money as anybody else. And of course, the problem with unrestrained capitalism, big money and politics, you don't have to explain that. It's influence. You know, there's a whole thing, there's a street called 16th Street in Washington, right beside the Capitol.
Yeah.
It's just full of lobbyists. It's full of people with checkbooks trying to buy politicians. Right? So this is not in any way a Republican. Like a lot of the sort of left-leaning media, the liberal media tries to say, it's all Republicans, it's all Elon Musk and all. It's not. Like you've got people, huge plutocrats, always finance the Democrats as well as the Republicans. But the problem at the core of this is that the promise of democracy is one man, one vote. But the attraction of capitalism is one man, lots of votes. The rich guy has all the votes. The rich guy gets the best table at the restaurant, gets the most influence, all that sort of thing. So if you think of capitalism and democracy here are constantly in a friction. So on one hand, you have democracy needs to, in some way, temper the excesses of capitalism so that one man, one vote doesn't get entirely bulldozed by one man, loads of votes. One man with bulging wallet, loads of votes. That's the first thing. But on the other hand, if you've too much democracy and too much redistribution, it actually impinges on the animal spirits that drive capitalism and drive prosperity. So in effect, you know, politics is a truce between these two powers.
It's really finely balancing
it's
act.
It's a very, very fine balancing act. The truce is probably what we call, you know, social democracy or Christian democracy or the broad centre. Those sort of things. That's the truce. But it can be profoundly changed. It's fragile, as you said. And it can be changed by far too much money.
But so what kind of figures are we talking about here?
They're extraordinary, right? So the two presidential candidates in America raised more, just take this in, than $3.8 billion by mid-October of this year.
How many children's hospitals could you build for that?
Well, in Ireland, about one. But I mean, in most of the countries, you build about 8. But let's look at the billionaires, right? The billionaires have, of that 3.8 billion, close to 700 million has been donated by billionaires. So it's 18% or about 20% of the total, right? Trump is particularly dependent on billionaires. About a third of his money comes from the billionaire class, compared with about 6% of the funds raised by Harris come from billionaires. So Trump's finance base is very, very thin, but very, very rich. Whereas Harris's finance base is much broader and not so rich. But that doesn't mean that the Democrats are not in the pocket of somebody else, simply because from January 2023 to last week, Biden and Harris, that ticket, outraised Trump. And these are the figures. Biden and Harris raised 2.2 billion and Trump has raised 1.7 billion. So their war chest is bigger than Trump's, okay? And the rich guys have placed their bets. At least there are 800 billionaires identified by Forbes magazine in the United States. And 144 of them have given to one or the other crowd. So they're in the mix completely. So what you can see is that the billionaires are in it for Trump, but they're also in it for the Democrats too. You know, and that's just billionaires, let alone different corporations and all that sort of stuff. And of course, it's like the indecent proposal, John. You don't give money without expecting favours.
Of course, absolutely. But we are having an election coming up, I don't know, sometime soon. Let's have a look after the break at how money is distributed here and donations and all that works in here and across Europe. So, Mark, we're talking about this plutocracy, not democracy in America. But here's the thing. You're talking there just before the break about why these billionaires, of which there's, what do you say, 800 of them. Some are donating to the Republicans, to Trump. But there are a significant number donating to Harris when she's also talking about raising taxes and stuff. So what's their thinking behind it?
So basically, if you're a billionaire, as I've quoted before, I think every billionaire is a policy failure, right? Okay? If you're a billionaire, you're doing very well out of the status quo. So one thing you don't want maybe is somebody to rock the boat. And the thing about Harris is she represents continuity from Biden, whose continuity in effect from Obama, whose continuity from Bush and Clinton, right? So Harris represents stability. Now, interestingly, a letter signed by more than a dozen billionaires last month who endorsed Harris explained their belief that Harris will, and I quote, continue to advance fair and predictable policies that support the rule of law, stability, and a sound business environment. So what they want is, business doesn't want instability. So they just they're doing very well, thank you very much, and they're prepared to pay for stability.
Yeah.
What Trump represents is chaos and madness, right? And there's enough billionaires to say, do you know what, maybe you stoke the madness enough and really weird things happen. And with weird things comes risk. And with risk comes a threat to us. So that's why they're playing. They're laying off their bets. You know?
They don't want the deplorables knocking on their gated communities.
Precisely. And what they know about the Democrats is the Democrats will maintain the status quo. And the Democrat billionaires are kind of Wall Street billionaires, Silicon Valley billionaires, and of course, Hollywood billionaires.
Yeah.
It's the entertainment business. And so their view is that basically Harris will leave us alone, whereas Trump might, by giving us too many tax breaks, focus on our outrageous wealth and piss off the average dude. So it's a very, if your nest is incredibly well feathered, just leave it well alone. And I think that's what they're doing.
So talk to me about the other Harris, Simon Harris.
Simon Harris. Well,
and how does it work here and across Europe?
Well, in Europe, I'll give you one statistic, right? Joe Biden raised 1.6 billion to win the 2020 election. That is 70 times more than Macron spent to win the French election, even though France, as a population, is only 5 times smaller than America. So he spent 70 times more for a population that's only 5 times.
You just have to hammer the message home a bit more to those fellas.
Exactly. Here,
Did you not get it?
Did you not get it? Exactly. You big gobshites. I say it again. Right. Vote for me. Right. The total spend across all 12 candidates in the last presidential election in France was 83 million. 83 million.
Wow.
Trump has raised 1.7 billion for one guy. All 12 French candidates, 83, right? Same in Germany. Germany is a country with more billionaires per head than America. But they keep it very, very, very quiet.
Wow.
The country with the most billionaires per head in Europe is?
Switzerland?
Sweden. Social democratic, nice, cuddly, Swedes, ABBA, all that good stuff, right? Loads of billionaires.
Really?
But they keep it really, really quiet. But what they don't do, and this is the interesting thing is, if you want to keep your wealth very quiet, as the German billionaires and the Swedish billionaires do, it suits them very well to have very strict caps on electoral spends because nobody looks in their direction.
Yeah.
And they can just get on with the business of making money.
They just put all the money under their IKEA mattress.
I was in IKEA the other day.
No,
I was in IKEA the other day. There is an IKEA. Can I just have a shout out to Andrew in IKEA in Stephen's Green?
Right.
Because there was definitely more divorces prompted in that little IKEA showroom than anywhere else, right? And Andrew is a young gentleman, and he took me by the hand and Shan by the hand and almost said, "Don't fight. It'll be okay. Your kitchen can look like this, right? Andrew, you are a genius, okay? If it all fails as an IKEA salesman, there is a great role at a reconciliation, couples reconciliation. You'd make a great psychotherapist." And then
He probably is one.
Yeah, it's amazing. Anyway, back to the Swedes, right? In Ireland, right? So massive limits in Europe. In Germany, there's a cap of 50,000 euros per donor. That's it, right? Maximum.
Okay.
Ireland is much stricter. Candidates running for the Dáil can only spend maximum of 38,000 in a 3-seat constituency, 48,000 in a 4-seater, and 58 in a 5-seater, right? This is like a rounding error in America, right? Donations from individuals to companies are capped at 2,500 euros per year, while donations to individual candidates, so that's to parties, are limited to 1,000 euros per year, right?
Wow.
So in the old days, in the good old days of hockey, when money was flying around the place, so this is all as a result of tribunals and how he basically financed his lifestyle by taking bribes off people and then just giving them all sorts of political patronage and all. Do you remember George Redmond, who was the Dublin city manager,
Right.
who was caught in Dublin customs going through the customs to the Isle of Man with a bag full of fivers, right? A suitcase full of fivers, right? And his defense was, when the coppers said, "Where does the money come from?" He says, "I'm a very heavy saver." And that was all the builders and all the donations. That's all gone now in Ireland. Ireland is really clean.
Yeah.
So the rich guys cannot buy the election explicitly here. That doesn't mean that there isn't influence.
Well, there's influence, but there's also many ways to influence as well, you know?
But at least it's not like America where they're actually just giving cash.
Yeah.
You know, they're actually giving cash. No, well, of course you have lobby groups, you have PR companies, you have all sorts of things here.
Yeah, for 50 grand, if you bought a really good social media manager, you know, that could be your full campaign. It's just focus on TikTok and LinkedIn and away you go.
Okay.
Or not.
When we run for politics, John, we'll just do it all on TikTok. Right?
Yeah, well, get rid of the stupid posters on the
I love the
lamppost.
posters. I love the posters.
You stop seeing them after a while.
I know. It's ridiculous. Anyway, so the point is it's a totally different form of democracy here, right? But just a little echo from history before we go, right? So 1896 is the election that is the first real American election that is won by money.
Yeah.
By McKinley and Hanna raising money and defeating the Democrats and the populists, right?
Yeah.
McKinley ends up getting assassinated, right?
Right.
This is America. They assassinate people, right? He gets assassinated.
They clip their ears.
His vice president takes over, who's a guy called Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
Right? Now, amazingly, Teddy Roosevelt then, he's vice president, then he runs for election in 1902. He wins. Teddy Roosevelt goes on to become, and he is totally financed by billionaires. He goes on to become the man who destroys the billionaire class. Now, this is fascinating. So 10 years after the 1896 election, so 1906, you would have expected, like you might expect now, that billionaires in America will be stronger, will be more influential, will have more politicians in their pockets. But the pendulum swung in America, and Roosevelt could see that, and he went against them. So he regulated everything. He broke up their companies. He taxed them. He also
How did they react?
He came up because he knew they couldn't react. And it's the same way as if you were a strong politician and you go after Elon Musk, there'll be far more people happy than sad.
Yeah.
So Roosevelt was clever. He also came up with this great expression, predatory capitalism and predatory wealth. And he said, you are too rich and our country cannot survive as a democracy with this plutocracy beside us. So a word of warning to those billionaires who might think that the result tomorrow may be a reflection of their money and that will enmesh them in power for the next 20 years. No, the pendulum may well swing against you. And the Roosevelt example is, while you won an election in 1896, by 1906, you were enemy number one of the state. And that's where these billionaires could end up in the future.